So within A Christmas Carol, the title actually being A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas, first published in 1843. Notice it was an instant success, and because of that, since it sold so well, this allowed Charles Dickens to not have to worry about his day-to-day living any longer. He could afford to sit back and write now, so we see a much more uh, expeditious use of his time to write, and we see a greater output in his writing. It was written during a period of decline in the old Christmas traditions. So, as you can imagine, as people who live out in the countryside at Christmas time, they would celebrate midwinter because the winter solstice is the shortest day of the year. So after that, the sun's going to start coming back out. And when you live in really northern latitudes, you notice that much more than we do in Jacksonville. But sometimes, in England and parts of England during the winter, you only have about 5 hours of daylight, and then it starts getting longer and longer. During the summer, sometimes you'll have 14 or 15 hours of daylight, and you see that you can really notice the days getting shorter and longer. And so, to celebrate the coming out of the sun again, they would go get the Christmas trees. They would have the songs they would sing. They would do all of these different family traditions. Well, now as people have started moving into London, they can't really afford to go out and get Christmas trees. Their lives are somewhat miserable, so they're not really singing all these happy, festive Christmas carols. And so he had really started noticing that within his lifetime, some of the old traditions of Father Christmas, of different things, were just disappearing. And that's why he wanted to write A Christmas Carol, was to harken back to some of those things, talk about the Christmas tree and the carols. So those were things that were really important to him, to have those Christmas traditions really woven through even the poorest of families, so that people, as they started telling the story, it would remind them to not forget these traditions. It's a Victorian morality tale. So it takes place during Victorian era. It tells us a moral to the story of an old miser, Ebenezer Scrooge, who undergoes profound experience of redemption. Notice that he was a financial money changer who had devoted his life to the accumulation of wealth at the expense of others. And he holds anything other than money in contempt, including friendship, love, and Christmas. So for him, it's all about money. So if we think back to the chart that I'd shown you about social ideas and how those different circles moved, he would always only be looking out for himself. He was a me person no matter what. He never even considered himself as any other community. He was never part of the London community or the aristocratic community or any other community where he would say we and look out for the betterment of more than one person. It was always me to him. And so some of the themes we have dealing with it: social injustice and poverty. And so that was an important aspect to his writing. We see that he wrote in the wake of the British government changes to the welfare system known as the Poor Laws. Those changes which required, among other things, welfare applicants work on treadmills. And so that would allow them even to power certain types of machinery. If you're receiving government handouts, you're still having to do something to be a productive member of society. This then he was able to start, once he wrote it, he then changed it, edited it down, and turned it into a speaking piece, so that he was able to go around and charge a little bit more for engagements, didn't have to spend as much time writing, and he could travel, talk about his work, do public readings, as we saw in Unquiet Dead, that he's in Cardiff right before Christmas, and he's estranged from his family because of it, having spent so much time away, that they encourage him to go home and to spend time with his family at Christmas. We've already talked about London at this point was the largest city in the world. It had, at 1800, that first map I showed you, about 1 million people. By 1880, 4.5 million, so it quadrupled in size. So massive amount of people in a very small area. You just get an idea here of how crowded and shoved in everyone is. And then a couple of final thoughts about this. We see that London was not. London was really kind of a city split in two. If you were on the west side end of the city, that was the nicer end, and the east end was the poor end. That's where the pickpockets, prostitutes, drunks, not drugs, drunks, beggars, vagabonds fill the street. Open sewer, which would running into the Thames. People would use water from the Thames for their drinking water, so there were constant bouts of cholera. So it depends on where you live in London on what type of London experience you had, but for many people, the poor, it was a very horrible experience. People didn't wash a lot. Main use was gas lamps. We see a lot of gas lamp. Side alleys not lit, so rife for criminal activity. And then the houses are lit by candles or small gas lamp. Again, which we saw in the Unquiet Dead, which took place in this time frame. And so it's an interesting aspect is in the Christmas Carol of Doctor Who, it takes place in the 44th century. So we go, 20 centuries later than where we are, but it's still using kind of the same technology of gas lamps, candles, side streets, etc. And we'll look at that in just a moment in more detail. And then a picture of a stereotypical factory at the time. Notice the children in here and the women. You don't see men because men would be out working at more manual labor jobs. This would just either they would just have to pull levers or monitor the machine as it's running. But notice they're still somewhat a little bit dressed up, in boots. She's dressed in a dress. He's wearing a hat. So you still try to present, the best image as you could. I've already talked about the cholera and the pollution at the time frame. And things that you can already imagine, that there were workhouses built. Basically think of barracks, like army barracks, huge amounts of people shoved into one area. Usually factories would build them nearby so that people wouldn't have to wander off too far from their jobs. So they could work 14, 18-hour days, go home, go back to their barracks, sleep for a couple hours, and come back to work. And then we're going to have one final presentation